Hi, it's time for another First Chapter Friday, and continuing on with the October scary stories. Scary because they could be very real. I've chosen one of my top 5 scariest books of all time. It is The Hot Zone by Richard Preston. And it's scary because if you'll notice on the spine, this is a nonfiction book. So this is based on fact. These are facts, not make believe, facts. And the title, The Hot Zone, refers to a couple of different things that you'll learn about in this book. It is an AR book. If you're interested, it's worth 16 points. Quiz number 17818. I'm going to skip part of the first part of the chapter. We meet Charles Monet, who is in a small village working at a sugar factory, and he takes a vacation at Christmas, takes a lady friend, and they go climbing Mount Elgon and exploring the different caves. And then he returns to work, which is where we pick up the story. Charles Monet returned to his job at the pump house at the sugar factory. He walked to work each day across burned cane fields, no doubt admiring the view of Mount Elgon. And when the mountain was buried in clouds, perhaps he could still feel its pull, like the gravity of an invisible planet. Meanwhile, something was making copies of itself inside Monet. A life form had acquired Charles Monet as a host, and it was replicating. The headache begins, typically on the 7th day, after exposure to the agent. On the 7th day after his New Year's visit to Kittim Cave, January 8, 1980, Monet felt a throbbing pain behind his eyeballs. He decided to stay home from work and went to bed in his bungalow. The headache grew worse. His eyeballs ached, and then his temples began to ache, the pain seeming to circle around inside his head. It would not go back away with the aspirin, and then he got a severe backache. His housekeeper, Johnny, was still on her Christmas vacation, and he had recently hired a temporary housekeeper. She tried to take care of him, but she really didn't know what to do. Then on the 3rd day after his headache started, he became nauseated, spiked a fever, and began to vomit. His vomiting grew intense and turned into dry heaves. At the same time, he became strangely passive. His face lost all appearance of life and set itself into an expressionless mask, with the eyeballs fixed, paralytic, and staring. The eyelids were slightly droopy, which gave him a peculiar appearance, as if his eyes were popping out of his head and half closed at the same time. The eyeballs themselves seemed almost frozen in their sockets, and then they turned bright red. The skin of his face turned yellowish, with brilliant star-like red spectacles. He began to look like a zombie. His appearance frightened the temporary housekeeper. She didn't understand the transformation in this man. His personality changed. He became sullen, resentful, angry, and his memories seemed to be blown away. He was not delirious. He could answer questions, although he didn't seem to know exactly where he was. When Monet failed to show up for work, his colleagues began to wonder about him, and eventually they went to his bungalow to see if he was all right. The black and white crow sat on the roof and watched them as they went inside. They looked at Monet and decided that he needed to get to a hospital. Since he was very unwell and no longer able to drive a car, one of his co-workers drove him to a private hospital in the city of Kisimu on the shore of Lake Victoria. The doctors at the hospital examined Monet and could not come up with any explanation for what had happened to his eyes, or his face, or his mind. Thinking that he might have some kind of bacterial infection, they gave him injections of antibiotics, but the antibiotics had no effect on his illness. The doctors thought he should go to Nairobi Hospital, which is the best private hospital in East Africa. The telephone system hardly worked, and it did not seem worth the effort to call any doctors to tell them that he was coming. He could still walk, and he seemed able to travel by himself. He had money. He understood he had to get to Nairobi. They put him in a taxi to the airport, and he boarded a Kenya Airways flight. A hot virus from the rainforest lives within a 24-hour plane flight from every city on Earth. All of the Earth's cities are connected by a web of airline routes. The web is a network. Once a virus hits the net, it can shoot anywhere in a day. Paris, Tokyo, New York, Los Angeles, wherever planes fly. Charles Monet and the life form inside him had entered the net. The plane was a Fokker Friendship with propellers, a commuter aircraft that seats 35 people. It started its engines and took off over Lake Victoria, blue and sparkling, dotted with the dugout canoes of fishermen. The fishermen turned and banked eastward, climbing over green hills, quilted with tea plantations and small farms. The commuter flights that drone across Africa are often jammed with people, and this flight was probably full. The plane climbed over belts of forest and clusters of round huts and villages with 10 roofs. The land suddenly dropped away, going down in shelves and ravines, and changed in color from green to brown. The plane was crossing the Eastern Rift Valley. The passengers looked out the window at the place where the human species was born. They saw specks of huts clustered inside circles of thorn bush, with cattle trails radiating from the huts. The propellers moaned, and the Friendship passed through cloud streets, lines of puffy rift clouds, and began to bounce and sway. Monet became airsick. The seats are narrow and jammed together on these commuter airplanes, and you notice everything that is happening inside the cabin. The cabin is tightly closed, and the air recirculates. If there are any smells in the air, you perceive them. You would have not been able to ignore the man who was getting sick. He hunches over in his seat. There is something wrong with him, but you can't tell exactly what is happening. He is holding an air sickness bag over his mouth. He coughs a deep cough and regurgitates something into the bag. The bag swells up. Perhaps he glances around, and then you see that his lips are smeared with something slippery and red, mixed with black specks, as if he had been chewing coffee grounds. The eyes are the color of rubies, and his face is an expressionless mass of bruises. The red spots, which a few days before had started out as star-like spectacles, have expanded and merged into huge, spontaneous purple shadows. His whole head is turning black and blue. The muscles of his face droop. The connective tissue in his face is dissolving, and his face appears to hang from the underlying bone, as if the face is detaching itself from the skull. He opens his mouth and gasps into the bag, and the vomiting goes on endlessly. It will not stop, and he keeps bringing up liquid, long after his stomach should have been empty. The air sickness bag fills up to the brim with a substance known as vomito negro, or the black vomit. The black vomit is not really black. It is a speckled liquid of 2 colors, black and red, a stew of tarry granules mixed with the fresh red arterial blood. It is hemorrhage, and it smells like a slaughterhouse. The black vomit is loaded with virus. It is highly infective, lethally hot, a liquid that would scare the daylights out of a military biohazard specialist. The smell of the vomit fills the passenger cabin. The air sickness bag is brimming with black vomit, so Monet closes the bag and rolls up the top. The bag is bulging and softening, threatening to leak, and he hands it to a flight attendant. When a hot virus multiplies in a host, it can saturate the body with virus particles from the brain to the skin. The military experts then say that the virus has undergone extreme amplification. This is not something like the common cold. By the time an extreme amplification peaks out, an eyedropper of the victim's blood may contain 100 million particles of virus. During this process, the body is partly transformed into a virus particles. In other words, the host is possessed by a life form that is attempting to convert the host into itself. The transformation is not entirely successful, however, and the end result is a great deal of liquefying flesh mixed with virus, a kind of biological accident. Extreme amplification has occurred in Monet, and the sign of it is the black vomit. He appears to be holding himself rigid, as if any movement would rupture something inside him. His blood is clotting up. His bloodstream is throwing clots, and the clots are lodging everywhere. His liver, kidneys, lungs, hands, feet, and head are becoming jammed with blood clots. In effect, he's having a stroke through the whole body. Clots are accumulating in his intestinal muscles, cutting off the blood supply to his intestines. The intestinal muscles are beginning to die, and the intestines are starting to go slack. He doesn't seem to be fully aware of pain any longer because the blood clots have lodged in his brain are cutting off blood flow. His personality is being wiped away by brain damage. This is called depersonalization, in which the liveliness and details of a character seem to vanish. He's becoming an automaton. Tiny spots in his brains are liquefying. The higher functions of consciousness are winking out first, leaving the deeper parts of the brainstem, the primitive rat brain, the lizard brain, still alive and functioning. It could be said that the who of Charles Monet has already died, while the what of Charles Monet continues to live. The vomiting attack appears to have broken some blood vessels in his nose. He gets a nosebleed. The blood comes from both nostrils. Shining, clotless, arterial liquid that drips over his teeth and chin. This blood keeps running because the clotting factors have been used up. A flight attendant gives him some paper towels, which he uses to stop up his nose. But the blood still won't coagulate, and the towels soak through. When a man is getting sick in an airline seat next to you, you may not want to embarrass him by calling attention to the problem. You say to yourself that this man will be all right. Maybe he doesn't travel well in airplanes. He is airsick, the poor man, and the people do get nosebleeds in the airplanes. The air is so dry and thin. And you ask him weakly if there's anything you can do to help. He does not answer, or he mumbles words you can't understand, so you try to ignore it. But the flight seems to go on forever. Perhaps the flight attendants offer to help him. But victims of this type of hot virus have changes in behavior that can render them incapable of responding to any offer of help. They become hostile and don't want to be touched. They don't want to speak. They answer questions with grunts or monosyllables. They can't seem to find words. They can tell you their name, but they can't tell you the day of the week or explain what has happened to them. The friendship drones through the clouds, following the length of the Rift Valley, and Monet slumps back in the seat. And now he seems to be dozing. Perhaps some of the passengers wonder if he is dead. No, he is not dead. He is moving. His red eyes are opening and moving around a little bit. It is late afternoon, and the sun is falling into the hills to the west of the Rift Valley, throwing the blades of light in all directions, as if the sun is cracking up on the equator. The Friendship makes a gentle turn and crosses the eastern scarp of the rift. The land rises higher and changes in color from brown to green. The Nyang Hills appear under the right wing, and the plane now descending passes over parkland, dotted with zebra and giraffes. A minute later, it lands on Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. Monet stirs himself. He's still able to walk. He stands up, dripping. He stumbles down the gangway onto the tarmac. His shirt is a red mess. He carries no luggage. His only luggage is internal, and it is the load of amplified virus. Monet has been transformed into a human virus bomb. He walks slowly into the airport terminal and through the building and out to the curving road where taxis are always parked. The taxi drivers surround him. Taxi? Taxi? Nairobi Hospital, he mumbles. One of them helps him into a car. Nairobi taxi drivers like to chat with their fares, and this one probably asks if he is sick. The answer should be obvious. Monet's stomach feels a little better now. It is heavy, dull, and bloated, as if he has eaten a meal, rather than empty and torn and on fire. The taxi pulls out onto the Uhuru Highway and heads into Nairobi. He goes through grasslands studded with honey acacia trees, and it goes past factories. And then it comes to a rotary and enters the bustling street life of Nairobi. Crowds are milling on the dirt shoulders of the road, women walking on beaten dirt pathways, men loitering, children riding bicycles, a man repairing shoes by the side of the road, a tractor pulling a wagon load of charcoal. The taxi turns onto the road and goes past the city park and up a hill, past lines of tall blue gum trees. And it turns up a narrow road and goes past a guard gate and enters the grounds of Nairobi Hospital. It parks at a taxi stand beside a flower kiosk. A sign by the glass door says Casualty Department. Monet hands the driver some money and gets out of the taxi and opens the glass door and goes over to the reception window and indicates that he is very ill. He has difficulty speaking. The man is bleeding, and they will admit him in just a moment. He must wait until a doctor can be called, but the doctor will see him immediately, not to worry. He sits down in the waiting room. And it is a small room lined with padded benches. The clear, strong, ancient light of East Africa pours through a row of windows and falls across a table heaped with soiled magazines and makes rectangles on a pebbled gray floor that has a drain in the center. The room smells vaguely of wood smoke and sweat and is jammed with bleary-eyed people, Africans and Europeans sitting shoulder to shoulder. There is always someone in casualty who has a cut and is waiting for stitches. People wait patiently, holding a washcloth against the scalp, holding a bandage pressed around a finger, and you may see a spot of blood on the cloth. So Charles Monet is sitting on a bench in casualty, and he does not look very much different from anyone else in the room, except for his bruised, expressionless face and his red eyes. A sign on the wall warns patients to watch out for purse thieves, and another sign says, "Please maintain silence. Your cooperation will be appreciated. Note, this is a casualty department. Emergency cases will be taken in priority. You may be required to wait for such cases before receiving attention." Monet maintains silence, waiting to receive attention. Suddenly he goes into the last phase. The human virus bomb explodes. Military biohazard specialists have ways of describing this occurrence. They say that the victim has crashed and bled out. Or more politely, they say the victim has gone down. He becomes dizzy and utterly weak, and his spine goes limp and then nerveless, and he loses all sense of balance. The room is turning around and around. He is going into shock. He leans over, head on his knees, and brings up an incredible quantity of blood from his stomach and spills it onto the floor with a gasping groan. He loses consciousness and pitches forward onto the floor. The only sound is a choking in his throat as he continues to vomit blood and black matter while unconscious. Then comes a sound like a bedsheet being torn in half, which is the sound of his bowels opening and venting blood from the anus. The blood is mixed with intestinal lining. He has sloughed his gut. The linings of his intestines have come off and are being expelled along with huge amounts of blood. Monet has crashed and is bleeding out. The other patients in the waiting room stand up and move away from the man on the floor, calling for a doctor. Pools of blood spread out around him, enlarging rapidly. Having destroyed its host, the hot agent is now coming out of every orifice and is trying to find a new host. And that is part of the first chapter of The Hot Zone by Richard Preston, a nonfiction selection.